The Ukrainian people have already proven their resilience and ability to hold out against all odds against the Russian military, but to continue in that fight, they need more weapons, more ammunition, and maybe most importantly, more soldiers. Now, the United States and Ukraine's Western allies can facilitate more equipment transfers, but it's going to be on Ukraine to resolve this manpower issue, and the longer it lingers, the worse it's going to get. According to Russia analyst Michael Kaufman, he says Ukraine's manning situation is the kind of thing that's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Now, when Russia kicked off their full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, Ukrainian men of all ages were quick to sign up, and the Ukrainian military quickly ballooned from around 250,000 at the start of the war to over 700,000 very, very quickly. But now, 2.5 years into this meat grinder of a war, a lot has changed. And since Ukraine is fighting a war of attrition against a country roughly with 5 times the population, any change in recruitment numbers becomes a major issue very, very quickly. Now, in this assessment I'm going to run through today on the issues with Ukrainian manning in their military, you can actually disregard casualty figures. And I wanted to go about it this way intentionally because those numbers are debated at all levels. You're not going to find any two sources from each side that agree on one set of casualty figures. So the way we're going to approach this here is understanding that there are certainly casualties being taken, a lot of casualties being taken on both sides, but we can remove that entirely and still show how Ukraine is facing a significant manpower shortage as they continue their war with Russia. Now, to give you an idea of how bad this situation has become, there was an interview conducted, now this was a couple months ago, in February of 2024 at the front, where the Washington Post was able to speak with a handful of Ukrainian commanders, and they said that the biggest issue, the most pressing concern at the front is the shortage of personnel as Russia was kind of ramping up attacks earlier this winter. They say the commander of a battalion of a mechanized brigade fighting in Ukraine's east said that his unit currently has less than 40 infantrymen, and that a fully manned battalion should have more than 200 soldiers, so only 40 of the 200 authorized for that unit. Another battalion commander said that companies in his unit have on average 35% of the required manpower. Now, combat effectiveness is an indicator of how likely a unit is to accomplish a certain task. Now, it's a task that they would be assigned if they were at their full strength, right? So it has to align with their, baseline capabilities, if you will. But there's a lot of different things that go into that. One of those are casualties. It could also be ammunition, equipment, leadership, etc. For instance, if a unit only had 10% of their basic combat load of ammunition, but they had 110% of their personnel, they would be combat ineffective, right? Because they can't accomplish their mission with only 10% of their desired ammunition. Now, generally speaking, if 20 to 30% of a unit are casualties, as in out of the fight, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, that generally is viewed as combat ineffective. So in these examples listed above, the Ukrainian battalions at the front operating at 30% or less manpower, it shows that all of those are combat ineffective, at least as of the time of that interview. Now, the issue here is when you move a couple layers up the chain of command and a brigade commander or division commander or, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense looks at a board and says, we have 3 battalions in the East. In reality, they do not have 3 battalions. They have maybe 3 companies, right? Significantly less firepower, significantly less capabilities than they think on paper because that unit at 30% capacity right now is being listed as a battalion. And it's not. It cannot accomplish what a traditional infantry battalion would be able to accomplish. And it's not a knock on the Ukrainian training. If you only have 30% of your personnel, you're just not going to be able to do nearly as much. That's one of the major issues that we're starting to see more and more come out of the war in Ukraine. Now, I mentioned earlier that the manning issues for Ukraine are still a problem going forward, even if you ignore casualty figures. And look, Russia and Ukraine have both done a pretty good job, all things considered, of keeping those casualty figures under wraps, which is why there's so much speculation in all directions. But this next part is why we can actually get to this assessment and understand the gravity of this situation while ignoring kind of the elephant in the room, right? The killed, wounded, and captured Ukrainian soldiers that are no longer able to fight. The Washington Post said in their interview that troops who are mentally and physically exhausted because of overwork sometimes can't defend their posts, allowing Russia with more manpower and ammunition to advance. One of the battalion commanders said, quote, "They need to be replaced by someone, but there's no one to replace them. So they sit there longer and longer. Their morale drops. They get sick or suffer frostbite. They're running on empty. There's no one to replace them. The front is cracking. The front is crumbling. So again, not even talking about the number of killed, wounded, captured, or missing as these soldiers sit at the front under incessant shell fire, facing Russian attack maybe a couple times a day, maybe a couple times a week, maybe every couple weeks. It doesn't matter. It wears you down. And it has the long-term effect of exhausting a military force, in this case, Ukraine. And as this battalion commander says, the front is cracking. I think it's worth bringing up a map, looking at deep state map here to show how some recent gains have played out in Ukraine. And this very well might be due to the fact, couple things. One, there was a shortage of ammunition in Ukraine earlier this year. That's been rectified. But now, even with more ammunition coming in, we're still seeing Russia make progress in certain areas of the front. There's one of the main arguments for that is this. Ukrainian manpower shortages and some of the people at the front are not able to cycle off the line. And it leads to a reduction in their capabilities. Now, there's a couple different areas I wanted to highlight here when looking at how Russia has been advancing really in the last few months. The main one is west of Avdiivka. So this is an area that fell in February of this year, and very quickly, all things considered, related to the rest of this war, Russia was able to take a significant chunk of territory to the west of Avdiivka. In recent weeks, we've seen a fair amount of movement here towards Toretsk. I'm going to go back on the map a little bit, and you can see how just in the last few weeks, Russian forces have kind of slowly but steadily been able to move forward towards Toretsk through New York in the south here and start to encircle a decent-sized group of Ukrainian forces in this pocket here. There's been a little bit of movement around Chasiv Yar, but still this is a focus of Russian forces, not a lot of headway in recent months. But I did want to point to another area up here in the north, the Kharkiv offensive that kicked off a few months ago. This is an area where Ukrainian forces rushed in a lot of reinforcements. So compared with Avdiivka or Chasiv Yar or even Toretsk, in the Kharkiv region, we saw multiple battalions from Ukraine rush to this area to try to stabilize the lines. That's what's missing in some of these other areas of the front right now when we're kind of assessing this from the outside looking in. So when you look at the progress that Russia was able to make in a very short period of time, it stopped. Ukraine stopped that progress in its tracks and in some cases has been able to retake small amounts of territory. The reason for that is they brought fresh troops into the fight. Fresh-ish troops, right? They were brought from other portions of the front, but they were able to kind of reinforce. And one of the challenges further south around Avdiivka and Toretsk is there's not a lot of soldiers to plug those gaps, right? So this is becoming a major issue, and I think we're seeing it play out in real time where Ukrainian forces, to a degree, in certain areas of the front are just becoming exhausted. Now, Russian recruitment is the other side of this equation, right? So there's a lot of attrition at the front. You have killed, captured, wounded, and missing, and then both sides are trying to rebuild their forces in real time. Neither one is stopping. Now, Russian troops are believed to be arriving in Ukraine, new recruits coming into the force, I should say, at a rate of 25 to 30,000 per month. Now, more on that in a second, but if that was the case, Ukraine would need to attrit 1,000 Russian forces every single day to maintain a balance of power. Now, that's a very back-of-the-napkin math there, right? Because, we don't know how many Ukrainian soldiers are coming in to the fight. And again, we're kind of removing the entire Ukrainian casualty figure piece here, which they're certainly suffering casualties day in and day out. But it's going to take a lot. With 25 to 30,000 Russian soldiers coming into the fight every single month for Ukraine to maintain that force ratio. Now, Dara Masakot, in fact, spoke to this a little bit where she said, I don't have a lot of faith in those numbers, those Russian numbers of 25 to 30,000 per month. But what I do know is that whatever they are getting, it is enough to replenish what they're losing and to keep the pressure on. So this is one of the major concerns when looking at this manpower shortage right now. It's not just that we're seeing slow creeping gains by Russia in multiple areas of the front where the Ukrainian forces might be becoming exhausted, but this is how Russia is advancing without a second wave of mobilization. What if they decide to take that route and kick off a mobilization and pull in a quick 200, 250, 300,000 additional soldiers? That could be a major problem for Ukraine really in the next 6 months. It takes a while for those soldiers to be trained, equipped, and moved out to the front. In fact, Russian mill blogger Two Majors kind of talked about this, where he said, in general, the semi-national war continues. Significant was the doubling of payments for concluding a contract with the Russian armed forces. Thus, the country is moving away from the so-called second wave of mobilization and replenishes the depleted units at the front, preparing to continue the war, which has already become too long. There's a lot of political issues with mobilizing a population. We're seeing that in Ukraine right now, and it's been an issue in Russia. So what they've been able to do so far to plug those gaps is to increase pay to Russian soldiers to get more people that are willing to join. And according to two majors, that's doing the trick right now. And that's doing the trick enough right now for Russia to continue advancing in multiple areas of the front. Now, it's a little bit crazy to say this, but if you can remove casualties entirely from your mind when looking at this ongoing war, and I'll pull the map back up here to give you an idea of the areas we're looking at, I think we've seen at this point that the casualty figure isn't going to force Putin to abandon his plans for Ukraine, and the more people he has in uniform, the better chance they have at simply exhausting the Ukrainian armed forces over the next coming months and or years. So again, go back to the troops that aren't being rotated out of the front in Toretsk, in Chasiv Yar, west of Avdiivka. They just can't fight like fresh soldiers and are not going to be able to continue to hold back Russian forces indefinitely. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Ukraine is making some adaptations in very real time here. So Ukraine did actually follow the Russian model a few months back, and they looked at their prison population to try to increase numbers in the force. And reports early on are that around 5,000 additional soldiers were added to the Ukrainian military from the prison system, where they would serve a period of time in exchange for a conditional early release. That's 5,000 people, right? That's important. Every soldier matters, of course, but it's just kind of a dent in the overall problem, if you will. The big move that's been made recently was the passage of a new mobilization law in Ukraine that lowers the conscription age of mandatory service from 27 to 25, which of course opens up a significant number of new recruits. More on that 25 number here in a second. And there's a few concerns, really, when looking at this. First, the initial drafts of this conscription bill had the idea of demobilizing military personnel after 36 months of service and then rotating those on the front every 6 months. But eventually, by the time this came to passage, all of those were removed. So the demobilization, the kind of long-term readiness of the force, ended up not being a portion of this mobilization bill. Instead, it really just focused on pulling more people into the force. The second big issue I wanted to call out here is you can see that the conscription age was dropped from 27 to 25. I think a lot of people are hearing that and saying, why not 18? It seems like most countries around the world, 18 is the number. United States, 18 is the number here to join the military. And people as young as 18 can join, can volunteer to fight in the Ukrainian military, but there's not mandatory service right now between the ages of 18 and 25. And this is something that a lot of people have pointed to recently, saying the Ukrainian leadership is essentially trying to have the best of both worlds, right? They want to not disrupt the civilian population as much as possible, but still have the necessary forces to fight and push back the Russian military. There was a quote here from one of the interviews in the Washington Post up front with the Ukrainian soldiers, where they said, quote, "Every soldier thinks about the guys just walking around Dnipro or Lviv or Kyiv. They think about them and they want to have a rest too. Of course, the thought pops into their heads that some guys still get to stroll around back home while they sit on the front line." You have to understand that you have to expect that, right? Especially when you have soldiers as young as 18, 19, 20 that are volunteering, signing up and going to fight for the front, seeing that they have friends back home that are not required to serve at all while there is a manpower issue in Ukraine is going to cause some division. Dara Mascot talked to this as well, where she said, if you look at the Ukrainian side, I don't know how much longer they're going to be able to make this position that they have right now, where they're saying this is an existential war. But if you look at the policies in terms of manpower or the economy or just the daily life of the citizens, Kyiv is trying to keep life as normal as possible for as much of the population as they can. There's a discrepancy there. And these dynamics continue to become choppy and undefined in the future. I'm not sure how long Kyiv can continue holding them in this cognitive dissonance. It's a real thing. Again, trying to really have both sides here. And it seems like, 2.5 years into this war, that the Ukrainian leadership is going to have to make a tough decision here. And maybe in order to get the requisite number of people in uniform, drop that conscription age to at least 20, if not 18. Now, when looking at the overall picture of the Ukrainian armed forces, all of this at this point has been talking about men joining the military, but I should note that women at this point are not subject to conscription, but they can, and many have, around 60 thousand actually at this point, have chosen to enlist in the Ukrainian military, and they're serving in a variety of positions, including frontline roles fighting the Russian forces. Now, I don't want to bring all of this up in kind of downer tone and have no ideas on how to fix it, but I do want to recognize that I'm sitting here in the United States. I'm not Ukrainian, so it's very hard to look at what exactly would resolve this issue and what is reasonable for them to take on here in the coming months. Really, this is not something that we can wait on for years. What I do know, and I think we can probably point out from halfway around the world, are some of the issues that are coming out related to the manning issue, and identifying those. Maybe if those are addressed, it would lead to stronger and higher numbers of people wanting to join the Ukrainian armed forces. First and foremost, one of the things coming out is people are wondering if they're going to face a lifelong disability, be severely wounded, and whether or not the government is going to have the ability to care for them and their families long term. That's a real concern and should be for any soldier going off to war. And Ukraine probably needs to double down and show exactly what that care is going to look like for soldiers, not just when they get home off the battlefield today, tomorrow, or the next day, but in the coming months, years, decades. What does the veterans program look like in Ukraine 15 years from now, if you will? Give them some confidence that they're going to be taken care of for their duty to the country for the rest of their life. There's also a concern of what is the strategy here. And there's been a lot of pushback with the recent change to General Syrskyi taking over the Ukrainian military, where people now inside of Ukraine that are making this decision whether or not they're going to sign up and fight, they've lived through the 2023 summer offensive. They've lived through the meat grinders of Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where there's been a lot of argument in every one of those is the cost worth it? Were the sacrifices in 2022 worth the amount of territory that was taken back? You might get differing answers. Were the lives lost in Bakhmut or Avdiivka while Ukrainian forces held those positions until the very last moment? Were those worth it? Those are, again, very real debates. Wherever you fall on that issue, you have to understand that there's a lot of people in Ukraine having those very rational debates right now. Is there a coherent strategy to end this war? There were some interviews with individual Ukrainians saying, I don't know if my going off to the front and dying in a week is really going to help anything. You can't have that. Right? It's not going to incentivize anybody to come and fight. If they look at the overall strategy and say, we don't know where this is going. We want freedom. We want to liberate our territory, but it's hard to see day in and day out what that looks like long term. And then another problem that we have to bring up is corruption. There's corruption in every country around the world. There's corruption in Ukraine. That's nothing new. One of the issues tied to this specific item of manpower in Ukraine is there has been a lot of bribes that have been paid and people that have been caught and arrested just for this issue trying to evade service. And what they're finding is that more and more there's kind of a fracturing among the population where the wealthy, more well-connected people are able to find ways out of military service, whereas those without as much money or without those connections have to join the armed forces, which kind of sounds like an issue in every country around the world ever when there's a major war. Again, just a couple items there that I think probably would be worth, if Ukraine were able to address those, it might lead to more people willing and able to sign up and take some of these battalions that are 30% strength and get them to 50, 60, 70, maybe even 100%. Because Ukraine, they are able to and are doing a pretty good job at this point of holding the lines with some of these depleted units and with not as much manpower as they need. But again, they're facing a country with 5 times the population. Russia has deep pockets, a deep bench. They can keep pouring more and more people in. And even if Ukraine is not suffering casualties at a significant rate or even at a higher rate than Russia, their troops are going to be exhausted. They need people to rotate in and off the front if they want to, 1, continue to stop the Russian advance, and 2, have any hope of pushing on the offensive and liberating territories in the east and the south. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix between a newsletter and a website. We put out a couple articles a week talking about things like Iran, the Houthis, Russia, AI, drone warfare, a bunch of things that I think are pretty interesting. If you want to check it out, of course, linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.